Senator Bharat.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam President, for the opportunity to contribute to the 2016 budget debate. First, let me start by both congratulating you and wishing you well on your new office as President of the Senate. Madam President, I'm sure it's clear to all of us that this is a political rather than a developmental budget. It is woefully short on policy prescriptions that are required to build on the strong platform left behind by the last government. It is riddled with inconsistencies and inaccuracies, which I will point out at a later date, but deliberately calculated, Madam President, to mislead the nation regarding the true state of the country's financial affairs. Its sole purpose is to create panic and to spread fear amongst our citizens. Essentially, Madam President, it is bad politics at the expense of good economics. It is a document, Madam President, I hasten to add, that shows a complete lack of understanding of our economy and what is necessary to take us forward in this new world where we face new global dynamics of trade, of differences between how we do business in future. And it shows a pathological disregard, Madam President, for sound and stable financial management and economic direction. Madam President, the Minister had a golden opportunity to present a roadmap for a better Trinidad and Tobago, but instead he gave us a dim and dismal document without any hope, inspiration, or any plan for future generations. Madam President, the bombastic and sanctimonious opening statements of the budget, and I quote, "People of TNT rejected the politics of deception, betrayal, greed, arrogance, waste, and mismanagement," totally and conveniently ignores the history of the PNM themselves as the most notorious and corrupt organization this country has ever seen. From O'Halloran to Calder Heart, Madam President, the Tesoro scandal, the $100 million Caroni complex, Caroni Racing Complex, the gas station fiasco, exposed by then Jean Miles, public servant, who, as a matter of fact, died almost pauperized and as a vagrant. The McDonnell Douglas kickbacks, the Mount Hope Medical Complex, ISCOT, the two failed summits, the National Oncology Center that cost this country $100 million that we had nothing to show for, the Prime Minister's Residence and Diplomatic Center with the $3,000 bed sheets, many of you in the back may not know of, the aborted 50 early childhood learning centers that were supposed to have been built by Haji, the Korean company. They absconded with 40 million Trinidad and Tobago dollars. The 3 performing arts centers, Madam President, one of them now shut down, unusable, the other not yet completed. World GTL, $3 billion of taxpayers' money down the drain. Alutrint, Alutech, the Taruba Stadium, Las Alturas, the refinery upgrades, the waterfront project that was supposed to have cost, and we were told in this House, $1.8 billion. When we did the research, it cost over $4 billion and will mortgage our children's future for 17 years. The OPVs, the inoperable fast ferries that we bought from Austal in Australia that's now parked up somewhere. The MV Sue that has never moved a day in its life. The useless blimps, Madam President. The Tamina Intech Park that we've only just completed. That was $2.2 billion spent on it by the previous government. We've only just found a tenant for that building in August of this year. The $500 million Rapid Rail, Madam President. The Secret Scholarship Fund. And all of it encapsulated in one chilling statement by a PNM stalwart and former colleague of the Minister of Finance. And I quote, "All are we thief." That is what we are faced with, Madam President. The Finance Minister conveniently forgot when he hurriedly made his way to the UF Commission and as a self-labeled expert, he went to the commission and accused the now Prime Minister of fiddling the funds and fiddling the books at Cleaver Heights. He asked, where did $10 million gone? He accused the now Prime Minister of fronting for a Syrian construction company. Madam President, this is all a matter of public record. This is a commission of inquiry paid for by taxpayers' money. When the now Prime Minister's attorneys responded, they said, and I quote, "In our final words to the Commission, given the conduct of Minister Imbert before this Commission, we feel constrained to comment on what may be viewed as an abuse of public resources to pursue a private agenda." This is the man who stands in the Parliament and talks about corruption and nepotism and cronyism. This is a man who was accused in the same Off Commission by the same contractor, and in fact referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions of brazen malfeasance in public office and called upon the DPP to investigate him. So, Madam President, I put no store in the opening statement made by the Minister of Finance because he has absolutely no moral turpitude to be talking about corruption and nepotism and cronyism in this Parliament. Madam President, they now want to present this country with a mass transit system, a Toco ferry, a port service, a new Port of Spain container port, airport and other industrial parks, overpasses, national highways, national broadband, a maritime shipbuilding and repair sector, TTIFC, Revenue Authority, Police Management Agency, Police Inspectorate, Universal Healthcare System, Universal Health Insurance System. Madam President, when it comes to transparency and accountability, I just want to put on the record the one thing, and that is, I want to remind this House that it was the People's Partnership Government that introduced the Standing Finance Committee that saw every single Minister of Government being grilled regarding the expenditure of their ministries. It was this People's Partnership Government that introduced Prime Minister's Question Time, where for the first time in the history of this country, on a monthly basis, the Prime Minister was forced to get up and respond to any question asked of her by any member of Parliament. It was this People's Partnership that brought into this House the procurement legislation, which was voted, of course, against by the then PNM opposition. So this, Madam President, is the document that is placed before this House, masquerading as a budget presentation. And you know what? Having lamented the state of the country's finances and the condition of the Treasury, the Minister then proceeds to unveil the largest budget expenditure in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. You know, Madam President, what they're essentially saying is that they've been able to increase the budgeted expenditure over the prior year as a clear signal that the confidence and the soundness of the national purse was in good hands. Because when they appraised the state of the economy, clearly they would have recognized that even though there had been a drastic fall in the price of oil and gas, that they had found a healthy national balance sheet. Otherwise, they would not have been able to increase expenditure. Otherwise, it would have been reckless for them to do that. And they also found a healthy stock of foreign exchange. Because had they not done that, they would not have been able to direct the governor of the central bank, as they said, to clear up the system, clear up the backlog, and to manage the rate of foreign exchange thereafter. In addition, the minister has stated very clearly and categorically that he intends to approach international lenders to access major funding for projects. Well, of course, if you don't have a healthy balance sheet, you're not going to be able to do that, because you just will not be able to get the funds available. So clearly, they've inherited a sound economic platform and a very healthy national balance sheet on which they can make these promises. Madam President, I also want to alert the population that when the People's Partnership Government prepared the 2014-2015 budget. It was done so when the price of oil was over $100. Today, the price of oil is at $45. The PNM knows that the price of oil is at $45. Yet still, your budget is predicated on a number that is higher, and your expenditure is predicated on a number that is higher than when oil was at $100. That is reckless. It is irresponsible. Madam President, the threat to our economy has been laid. And what I want to leave the nation with today is the deception and dishonesty that has been displayed in their very first budget, and that the integrity of the PNM has already been called into question. Madam President, let me start by saying that this budget will no doubt cause inflationary issues in the economy. The author of the document, who was so lauded yesterday by Minister of Rural Government, clearly doesn't have a grasp of basic economics. Not the minister, not this minister, the Minister of Finance. The increased levies, Madam President, the increases in fuel prices means that businesses are going to face a very tough time with regard to the costs, with regard to higher production costs and higher transportation costs. They in turn will transfer those additional costs to consumers and to other businesses through these higher prices. We may soon see spiraling inflation, out of control possibly, in every sector of the economy. We may even see layoff of employees and workers as a direct result of these organizations and these small businesses not being able to cope with these increased costs. In fact, Madam President, we know that some basic food items have already gone up. Doubles, we know, has increased in price. We also know that taxi fares have gone up in certain parts of the country. And we've not yet taken into account the additional costs of transportation costs of goods. And we've also certainly not, because it's an unknown factor, we don't know the effect of the increase on VAT in a myriad of products that we are told is coming, what effect that will have on the cost of doing business. Of course, also, Madam President, we've neglected the fact that property tax is going to be charged on businesses as well. It's not just residents. And so therefore there's going to be an additional cost involved in doing business. And who's going to bear the brunt of that cost, Madam President? Surely it's going to be the consumer. So, Madam President, it's not likely to be a very Merry Christmas for many of our citizens. You know, on the one hand, Madam President, on the one hand, the minister has increased the tax allowances for those earning between $5,000 and $6,000. But I want to tell you that the $250 saving that they're going to make is certainly going to be eroded by the additional costs that I just spoke about, the additional costs of living that they're going to have to encounter. But more than that, there are 42% of the working population today earning less than $5,000 a month. They're not getting an additional saving because of a tax allowance, but they are going to still have to bear the burden of the additional costs. They're the ones at the lower end of the scale, Madam President. They're the ones who are going to feel the pinch the most. They're going to feel the brunt of the increased cost of living. They're going to feel the cost of inflation. They're the first ones who are going to lose their jobs. This budget, Madam President, has absolutely no sympathy for the poor man. And you know what? What makes the whole situation worse, what exacerbates this situation, is the crying wolf, by suggesting that the economy is in a perilous state, it creates panic, or the potential to create panic. What does panic do? It makes human beings act in a certain way that actually creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, Madam President. Because when people panic, when they hear things are really bad, when they stop spending, there is less money going into the economy. When less money goes into the economy, there is less economic activity. When there's less economic activity, Madam President, there are less jobs. when there are less jobs, Madam President, the economy grinds to a halt. So the cry wolf syndrome that is being espoused by the Minister of Finance that things are so bad could essentially backfire on all of us. It's a reason why people like Alan Greenspan and now Janet Yellen, who is the chairman of the Fed, they are very cautious about the signals that they send. They're very cautious about what they say because they understand very clearly that they have a responsibility, that people hang on to their very word to make their decisions. But clearly in Trinidad and Tobago, we have no such responsibilities. Madam President, let me talk a little bit about the macroeconomic fundamentals of Trinidad and Tobago, because everything hinges on the macroeconomic fundamentals. In 2010, when we came into office, this country suffered for the first time negative growth of 4%. It was the first time in 17 years since 1993. Inflation year on year in July 2010 was running at 14%. We inherited at that time the CLICO debacle, $20 billion. We inherited $2.2 billion payable to contractors. We inherited $1.8 billion in outstanding refunds for VAT. And we inherited over 70 outstanding union negotiations that had not been dealt with by the previous regime. What the PNM is saying today is that we are at fault for having settled those very same arrangements in the last few months, something that they didn't do. It's a responsibility that they deflected from in 2010 and they passed it on to the next regime. But we fulfilled our obligations. But that essentially was what confronted us in 2010. And you know, much has been made about the budget deficit that this government has inherited. But let me say, first of all, for many of you who may not know, because you may not have a financial background, the $7 billion deficit is only an estimate. That will change in the next few months. But secondly, I want to remind all of us that the budget deficit that the People's Partnership inherited in 2010 was $6.4 billion. And that's not an estimate. That's an actual number. $6.4 billion we inherited in 2010. But you know, Madam President, if one were to look back at the review of the economy, because much has been said about reversals of fortunes and how much money has been spent and so on. If one were to look back at the review of the economy in 2009, you will see that the surplus, you will see that at the end of 2008, there was a budget surplus of $11.8 billion. So the PNM government went from a budget surplus of $11.8 billion, a surplus at the end of 2008, to a budget deficit of $6.4 billion at the end of 2009. That is a reversal, my friends, of $18.2 billion in 1 year. $18.2 billion in 1 year was the reversal. But I'll go further. The Minister of Finance has made much of the cash balances of this country. I had a cursory look at the current account balance, which is the cash balance held at the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, in 2008. In 2008, the current account at the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, according to the Review of the Economy 2011, was $8,518,000,000 US. That, Madam President, is equivalent to 53.6 billion TT dollars. The cash balance, the current balance of the central bank. In 1 year, from December 2008 to December 2009, that figure went from $8.518 billion to $1.614 billion. In other words, Madam President, it went from 53.6 billion TT dollars at the end of 2008 to $10.16 billion at the end of 2009. That is a reversal, my friends and Madam President, of $43.4 billion in 1 year. $43.4 billion in 1 year. This is not me saying this. When you get a chance, have a look at the review of the economy. So when your Minister of Finance stands in this House with his smug look, talking about reversal of finances.
Senator Barath, please, let's not use those descriptions, all right?
When the Minister of Finance stands in any of the houses and he speaks about reversals of fortunes, you must tell him that between 2008 and 2009, under the PNM regime, there was a reversal of fortune of $43.5 billion on the current account. But you know what, Madam President? We didn't behave like whimpering little prima donnas. We got on with the job. We got on with the job of running the country. You know, additionally, Madam President, I want to question whether it was deliberate on the part of the minister or whether he simply didn't know. That why did he exclude from the 2015 fiscal year, why did he exclude the one-off revenue items that he's now including in 2016? Comes across as unusual, because all of those revenue items were known to us to have come in September of 2015. Why were they excluded from the 2015 fiscal account? And I'll name some of them. 3.84 billion TT dollars came in for TGU. Why was that not included? The $1.5 billion for the IPO of NGL, why was that not included? The $500 million from NGC, why was that not included? Because had they been included, Madam President, and they amount to $5.84 billion, had they been included in the fiscal 2015 figures, the budget would not have been $7 billion, Madam President. The budget would have been closer to, the deficit, would have been closer to $1.2 billion. We ask ourselves, why is it that those one-off revenues were brought into 2016 to prop up 2016 and to deliberately make 2015 look worse than it was? And that is a serious question, because it sends all kinds of repercussions to the international agencies, Madam President. But you see, many will say that the minister was playing petty politics with the country's finances. The minister also went on to talk about the behavior of capital expenditure. During 2015. He actually suggested that capital expenditure was ramped up because of the election. The capital expenditure for all of 2015, Madam President, was $8.3 billion. I want to put it on the record of this venerable House, Madam President, that over the last decade, the top 3 years in terms of expenditure on capital items occurred under the last PNM regime. In 2007, Madam President, they spent $8.66 billion. In 2008, $10.13 billion. And in 2009, $9.05 billion. But figures on its own doesn't make much sense. So when I put it in context of the percentage of capital expenditure over total expenditure, it gives you a better idea. In 2015, the capital expenditure of the People's Partnership amounted to 13.5% of total expenditure. In 2014, it was 13.45%. In 2009, under their watch, it was 19.78%. In 2008, it was 18.8%. And in 2007, Madam President, it was a grand figure of 21.7% of percentage of capital expenditure of of total expenditure. So when they come here, or when the minister comes here to talk about ramping up capital expenditure, and it was only 8.3 billion, I have to tell you also, remind this Honourable House, Madam President, that 8.3 billion in 2015 is a far different figure to 8.3 billion in 2007 in terms of purchasing power. It's a lot less. So when you spend $10.13 billion in 2009, it's the equivalent of probably spending over $12 billion in 2015. So what are some of the other facts, Madam President, regarding the economy that we have been so lambasted about? In 2010, the Heritage and Stabilization Fund that we inherited was $21.1 billion, TT. In 2015, when we left office, it is $36.3 billion, a 65% increase. In 2010, the foreign exchange reserves of Trinidad and Tobago stood at $57.4 billion TT dollars. In 2015, when we demitted office, it stood at $65.47 billion, an increase of 14%. In 2010, when we came into office, unemployment was at 6.1%, July 2010. In 2015, when we demitted office, it was at a historical low of 3.3%. In 2010, when we came into office, year-on-year inflation, July 2010 was 14%, Madam President. Today, it is less than 8%, Madam President. In 2010, when we came into office, foreign direct investment in Trinidad and Tobago was at an all-time low, $501 million US dollars, 3.4 billion TT dollars, Madam President. When we left office, it was $15.12 billion in 2014. 5 times the amount. And according to a UN report in 2014, Trinidad and Tobago was able to attract more than 27% of total global FDI amongst small and developing states. Madam President, he's made a meal, the Minister of Finance, about debt to GDP. Many of us are ignorant. Many citizens are ignorant about debt to GDP and what it means. And when you say 46%, they think, oh my God, 46%, because 46% is higher than 38% when we came in. But when one considers the expenditure we had to undertake, when one considers the CLICO resolution, when one considers the gas subsidies, when one considers the wage settlements, when one considers GATE and all of the other capital projects, one can see why it was necessary. But let me put it in context, Madam President, because there are a lot of people out there who are confused. Yes, our debt to GDP is 46%. But the debt to GDP in Japan is 230%. The debt to GDP in Jamaica is 133%. The debt to GDP in Italy is 132%. The debt to GDP in Ireland is 110%. The debt to GDP in the big old United States of America is 103%, Madam President. The debt to GDP in Singapore, a country that we look up to, is 99%. The debt to GDP in Spain is 97%. France, 95%. United Kingdom, 89%. Germany, 75%. The debt to GDP in Canada is 86%. So our debt to GDP is being 46%. Ask yourself, is that reason to panic? Is that reason to send the population into a frenzy? Clearly not, Madam President. You know, much was made of the Moody's report, Madam President. Much was made of the Moody's report, but not a word, not a single word about the Standard & Poor's rating agency in December 2014, which affirmed Trinidad and Tobago's A rating for foreign and local currency sovereign credit ratings. And you know what they said, Madam President? They said the international rating agency cited the country's strong net external asset position, its low external vulnerabilities, and stable political system as the primary reasons for a very positive outlook. A mere 10 months ago. 10 months ago, that report was written by Standard & Poor's. Can we really believe the Minister of Finance when he says that the state of our economy is as poor as it is in such a short space of time, Madam President? Could we really have deteriorated that much in 10 months? You know, I had the pleasure, Madam President, of going with the Minister of Finance, Minister Hawaii, to sell Trinidad and Tobago via selling a $500 million US bond. I did the European markets and Minister Hawaii did the American markets. We're trying to see what level of confidence the outside world had in Trinidad and Tobago. And we floated the idea of selling a bond, $500 million US. Madam President, this was just over a year ago. The bond was 10 times oversubscribed. 10 times oversubscribed. We could have sold a bond for $5 billion US, Madam President, if we wanted to. That was the level of confidence just over a year ago in Trinidad and Tobago. And the Minister of Finance stands here and asks us to believe that things have deteriorated to that point. Madam President, I want to talk a little bit about the oil and gas sector because that's very important in determining how we go forward, because there's no doubt we are an oil and gas economy. But we all know that oil and gas takes a significant amount of time, investments take a significant amount of time to mature. The Minister of Finance recognized this when he spoke, but he was less than honest when he said that oil and condensate production has fallen from 100,000 barrels per day in 2010 to 80,000 barrels in 2015. And therefore, we must take decisive action in our energy sector to reverse the stagnation and decline of the last 5 years. What the minister didn't tell us was oil production fell from 150,000 barrels in 2005 to 100,000 barrels in 2010. A decline of 50%. A 50% decline, and that's where the decline started. And in the years from 2005 to 2010, Madam President, data from the central bank will show that investments in that sector all but collapsed. In fact, the PNM regime was continually being warned by the South Trinidad Chamber of Industry and other major players that had they not changed the fiscal regime, things would continue to get bad, from bad to worse, and there would be dire consequences to be suffered. But they failed. In fact, some of the articles I have here, I won't go through all of them, but just give you an example of one. The Guardian of September 18, 2003. South Chamber slams Manning on taxes. The South Chamber accused, and I quote, Prime Minister Patrick Manning of reneging on a promise for his government to favorably consider the revision of the fiscal regime for onshore oil production. They also demanded an explanation for his decision, pointing out, and I quote, if Manning does not reverse his decision, the sector could face terminal decline and loss of thousands of jobs. Nothing was done, Madam President, nothing. Again, another article, Guardian, April 21st, 2005. Without decisive action in this area, we are likely to see more companies exit Trinidad and Tobago's oil production business. We wait to see who will take their place and whether these changes will be in the best interests of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, there it was. The country failed to make the requisite investments that will take 5 to 7 years to mature. So if you don't take the decisions in 2002 and 2003, you're not going to be able to get any benefits until you invest. And that is what this government did. In 2010, when we came into office, Madam President, we found an industry that was stagnating. There was just one rig working offshore, Madam President, in 2010. One rig working offshore. And by introducing a series of pieces of legislation, I'll tell you it's 14 pieces of legislation introduced in finance bills from between 2010 and 2015, we were able to correct that, such that the number of rig days, Madam President, went from 1,132 in 2010 to 2,800 rig days in 2015. A more than doubling of rig days. And for those who know and understand the oil sector, you will know that is a metric for determining what will eventually be oil production in the country. And as a direct result of that, we've started to see a rebounding of foreign direct investment in that sector. In 2010, as I mentioned, $501 million. In 2011, that rose to $1.5 billion. In 2012, $2.2 billion, Madam President. And in 2014, over $2.4 billion in the sector. But it was irresponsible on their part not to have made the investments. Madam President, I want to talk...
Honourable Senator, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you. Madam President, in the short time that I have, I want to talk very quickly about agriculture, because that's very dear to my heart, and the Minister has talked about a number of incentives that he's going to introduce. I want to inform him, I'm embarrassed to do so, unfortunately, but I want to inform him, and maybe it's no fault of the Minister of Agriculture, because he would not have known, that all of these exemptions already exist. So please, and it's very clearly stated and articulated in the Value Added Tax Act, Chapter 7506, Schedule 2. I can arrange a copy for the Minister of Finance if he so wishes, as well as Part A of the 3rd Schedule of the Customs Act, which lists all of the items that are currently exempt from duties. Madam President, this incentive program that was done in 2012, Minister, 2012, you're probably aware of this, has all of the incentives. And I know that many of those involved in the sector have been up in arms, people like Mr. Joe Pires from Caribbean Chemicals and Mr. Kamal Hakim, who have been in the sector for many, many years, and they both said they are perplexed and confused at the Minister's statement, because all of these incentives have been in place for very many years. I'm also a little bit perplexed with the Minister's statement that essentially he'll be working primarily on structure and so on, when in fact the Minister himself in his budget statement has reiterated and reinforced the need to increase food production as an immediate step. So there seems to be a little mismatch. The other thing I want to just very briefly talk about, Madam President, is immigration forms that the Minister mentioned. The immigration lines that will be removed because there's no need for immigration anymore. I'm just letting you know that since June 11th, the Cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago took that decision, and I actually made the announcement at a post-Cabinet meeting on June 11th, 2015. And with regard to a 10-year passport, Madam President, I have a 10-year passport here in my hand. That was issued to Mr. Prakash Ramada. I'm also aware that there are some members on that side who have received 10-year passports. So please inform the Minister of Finance that these are already in place. So there's no need to.
He's sleeping on the job. He's suffering from insomnia.
Mr. Prakash Ramada. So please don't waste time trying to reintroduce things that have already been done. Madam President, I also want to make mention, I know that Senator Amin would have talked about the politicization of GATE and the graduate trainee. I'm also very concerned that this may not become another slush fund for the PNM. We are well aware of what the Equal Opportunities Commission would have stated regarding the suspicious scholarships that were granted under the last regime. And they also, I quote, records indicate that the vast majority of applicants who were granted financial assistance by the ministry lived in constituencies ruled by the People's National Movement, the Commission concluded. So we want to be certain that these funds are not going to be used for the graduate training program, and also for GATE, not going to be used for party hacks. So, Madam President, as I conclude, the Minister needs help, clearly, and very fast, and very fast. What this adds up to, Madam President, is something I call depression economics, because the entire country is depressed, and therefore, Madam President, yes, the entire country is depressed. It's depression economics. Madam President, this really is just a hodgepodge of stolen ideas. It's a surreptitious and deceitful document that regurgitates a lot of rejected proposals from the past. And it's an open assault, as far as I'm concerned, on the middle class and the lower income earners of Trinidad and Tobago, clearly prepared in conjunction and collaboration with the IMF. And again, unfortunately, Madam President, we seem to have surrendered our sovereignty to an international institution. But in any event, Madam President, it contains no notion of how we're going to sustain income, no revenue-generating measures beyond 2016, apart from suggesting a continuous sell-off of our state assets to fund the vanity projects, much in the same way that a piper does to maintain his habit, Madam President. PNM has also always been about talk rather than performance. 1962 to now, they've always promised but never delivered, Madam President, and that is their habit. Madam President, we're not all in this together, and unfortunately, the Minister of Finance has not given us any comfort that he knows what he needs to do to take this country forward. Madam President, I thank you very much.